The next thread in the market revolution was a regional economic specialization, especially in terms of commercial agricultural expansion. And what you began to get was regional specialization. So that if you look in New York, what they did was they did a lot of dairy products. They ran a lot of cattle. They did a lot of made a lot of hay, which of course was one way to feed cows, also to feed horses. Virginia was still making a lot of tobacco, so the same as it had been doing since the colonial era. But you can also see that Western Kentucky was now growing a great deal of tobacco as well. Way on down in Louisiana, they were growing sugar cane, a very lucrative crop, very wealth producing. But as in the West Indies, the sugar islands of the West Indies in the Caribbean, if you were an enslaved person and you were working on a plantation that was raising sugarcane, the mortality rate was much higher than it would be otherwise from disease and from injury and so on. That is where the expression being sold down the river comes from. So you're an enslaved person, and you're enslaved. Let's say in Tennessee, to give an example, and then you're sold, and you're sent down the river to work on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. What that means is your chances of survival are suddenly much less. But most of the Deep South was devoted to the cultivation of short strand cotton. And we'll get to what short strand cotton is in a bit, but it made short strand cotton was much easier to grow than other kinds of cotton, and once they learned how to cultivate this kind of cotton and sell it at a reasonable degree of profit, much of the Deep South got devoted to it. In terms of the expansion of commercial agriculture in the South, this is what it looks like, and these are what the various products look like, and there's a variety of them. But look at the distribution of slave labor, in these various slave states. 55% of slave labor went into the production of cotton. Now, this short strand cotton differed from the kind of what we call Sea Island cotton. And if you look on South Carolina and into Georgia, you'll see this kind of like this little purple fringe. Well, this was a long strand cotton that was really almost like ready to be converted into twine and yarn and so forth, and for textiles. Short strand cotton or short fiber cotton was a very different proposition. Now, short strand cotton had been around for a long time, and you can see um, a picture of short strand cotton, a cotton boll, at the lower left. Now, the problem though with this short strand cotton was that it had a lot of seeds inside it, and you could take enslaved people and put them to work pulling out these seeds one by one, but it was extremely labor intensive, and just really not worth it. Then in 1793, a guy named Eli Whitney um, invented something called the cotton gin. And Eli Whitney he was just ever since he was a kid, he would kind of go off by himself, and he would just invent things and come back to his family. I've made this and I've made that and the other thing. And when he was down in the South, he saw, this issue with the short strand cotton, and it just sort of interested him. How could you get out these seeds efficiently? And he came up with this cotton gin, which it was such a sort of a simple device that once he created it, people were just wondering, like, well, how on earth, didn't we think of this before? And oh, by the way, it was so easy to make once you understood the principle involved that people just simply made their own cotton gins. Eli Whitney did not make all that much money from it because people simply, took his intellectual property in the form of how to make a cotton gin and just made them um, and went to town. So this made the cotton gin made the cultivation of short strand cotton viable. And short strand cotton, unlike the sea island cotton, which as the name implies, could only be grown in a certain narrow band of territory, you could grow short strand cotton anywhere where there was a temperate climate and a reasonably long growing season. Soil was not really a problem. Short strand cotton would grow in most kinds of, sort of decent, soil. Um, and so it became the basis for the economy in the South. And this is where most enslaved persons were employed, was sowing the cotton seeds, hoeing in between the rows while the cotton was growing, and then harvesting it, um, when it was ready to harvest. And by the way, I've actually picked some cotton, and it hurts, because the leaves on the bolls are kind of sharp, and it's not pleasant work. You also have to kind of be hunched over doing it. That kind of sucks. And doing this hour upon hour upon hour upon hour, really from sun up to sundown, was very taxing work. And even after the American Civil War, if you were living in the American South and if you were African American, you were very much involved in this cotton economy in the sense of being the person who was doing the labor aspect of it, the labor intensive part of it, and doing it um, for for a share of the crop or for very low wages and so forth, under conditions that kept you in a permanent condition of poverty. Here is an engraving of enslaved Americans using the cotton gin, and you can see this is a larger, cotton gin than the one you saw with Eli Whitney's model. And you can also see, by the way, that they're happily going on that cotton gin. Well, this is a drawing made by a white person. And one of the things that whites, particularly white Southerners, liked to imagine was that their slaves were sort of contented people, and they were happy with their lot or content with their lot. And in Southern, we'll get into this more in another lecture, but Southern slaveholders like to think of themselves as kind of paternalistic figures when it came to their slaves. They sort of, at one level, they thought of slaves as kind of like they're kind of like their children, really. Um, and there was just this sort of patronizing attitude that they had, and these enslaved people were, scarcely felt like their masters were father figures, but they could turn that relationship to their advantage by saying that so and so is really sick, and then would appeal to the sort of paternalistic nature of the master to get assistance for a person who was sick, get medicine for them, and so on. So yeah, when you see these kinds of illustrations, these illustrations are not just pictures; they're pictures that tell a story of give you insight into the attitudes of the time, and really function more as documents than as illustrations per se. Well, here is cotton baled and ready for transport circa 1850. And one of the things that helped with the cotton industry was the availability of steamboats. And these are so you have the beginnings of steamboats in the early part of the 19th century. They're part of the transportation boom. They get larger and more efficient as time goes on. They are important everywhere where there is navigable water, but they are particularly important on the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. And all this cotton that we're looking at gets transported, downstream down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where it is sent off to factories in New England. We'll look at that in a bit. They're sent off to factories in Great Britain, and elsewhere. So now this cultivation, this large scale cultivation of cotton depended upon securing land from the indigenous peoples who still lived east of the Mississippi River. And we encountered this last week when we were looking at the administration of Andrew Jackson. Um, this is, and this the need for this land the for the cultivation of short strand cotton, which now looked like a really lucrative business. The need for this land was not the only factor driving the train of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, but it was a major factor. And this Indian Removal Act of 1830, driven by the need, for lands for cotton, resulted in the forced displacement of about 60,000 people of what we called the five civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850. They were sent primarily to what was then called the Indian Territory, what is now called Oklahoma. Um, and we think that during these journeys from their homelands east of the Mississippi River to the Indian Territory, somewhere between 10,250 and 17,300 Native Americans died. They died of disease, especially cholera, malnutrition, fatigue, and exposure to rain and cold. And so, these indigenous people, these Native Americans, were casualties in a literal sense, casualties of the market revolution. Now, to get back to cotton, well, indigenous peoples have been removed from these lands in the deep south. Cotton is being cultivated throughout the deep south. And look at the growth of cotton as an export product. 7% of American exports in 1800. Then, once you get the cotton gin and the beginnings of the large scale cultivation of short strand cotton, it's up to 32% of American exports. On the eve of the American Civil War, um, well over half of American exports consisted of short strand cotton. And so, it was cotton that brought in far more foreign wealth, wealth from Great Britain, wealth from France, wealth from other European countries, wealth in the form of gold, coming in than any other U.S. product. And so this wealth generated by cotton was such a crucial part of the American economy that Southern politicians spoke of King Cotton and said that no power in the world would dare make war on it. And what they meant was, on the eve of the Civil War, they believed that the federal government, would not dare to make war upon, you know, the Confederate South, that they would cut a deal with them, negotiate a deal, because the idea was, you couldn't go to war against something that created this much wealth. You could not afford to lose access to the wealth generated by all of this cotton, to say nothing of the cotton itself, which was important for the northern textile industry. So notice also that this tremendous wealth was the product of slave labor. And because this wealth generated the capital that helped to lead to the takeoff of the next phase of the American economy, the industrial economy, which accounted for making the United States first a great power among the world's other powers, and then ultimately a superpower. It is not going too far to say that the United States became an industrial giant in considerable measure because of the unpaid labor of enslaved Americans. And so from time to time, you will hear talk about slave reparations, which is to say money, to be paid to the descendants of enslaved Americans. What I've just told you is sort of the foundation of the rationale for that demand for for justice.